It's time for another episode of I Am Northwest Arkansas, the podcast covering the intersection of business, culture, entrepreneurship, and life in general here in the Ozarks. Whether you are considering a move to this area or trying to learn more about the place you call home, we've got something special for you. Here's our host, Randy Wilburn.
Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of I Am Northwest Arkansas. I'm your host, Randy Wilburn, and I'm excited to be with you as always. We are on video. That's right. We are sitting here in the Go Rogue X studio. I'm excited to partner up with one of my dear friends, Brian Fitton, and his amazing team here at Go Rogue X in Bentonville. They do such an amazing job, and I just want to give them a shout out right up front because it's not every day that we have access to this kind of quality equipment. And so we were doing something special with the Northwest Arkansas Council and Groundwork. And so we decided, why don't we videotape these particular podcast episodes? So you will hear this. Those of you, the purists that listen to me audio only, you will hear this while you're walking the dog. But then those of you that want to actually see my beautiful face and my wonderful guest today, well, you're in for a treat. Today's guest is Daniel Parolek, and Daniel is the author of a book called Missing Middle Housing. Very, very important topic. He actually came into town. He's been here several times, but he came into town specifically to speak to the Northwest Arkansas Council's Groundwork program. They put on a housing program just today, the day that we're actually recording this podcast, and did such a really good job of really just talking about how we can continue to improve upon our housing stock, how we choose to build smartly, and how we choose to develop and do infill in Northwest Arkansas in a way that makes sense. And so for those of you that have followed any of the work that we've done with Groundwork in the past, we just did a podcast with Bruce Katz, who talked about the importance of localism and the necessity to really build locally. We're talking about from a horizontal perspective, not a vertical when you're dealing with states or the federal government. So I think it's important to kind of carry that conversation on. So once you've decided and a locality has decided that, hey, we're going to do things differently, one of the first conversations is, well, okay, how are we going to do housing? And that's where my next guest comes in. So without further ado, Daniel Parolek, how are you doing?
Great. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Daniel, you're an architect, urban designer. You specialize in innovative housing solutions and sustainable urbanism. You're the co-founder of Opticos Design, a firm known for its focus on walkable urbanism and missing middle housing. You've advocated for creating diverse, affordable, and livable communities, something that we just talked about off the air. You're also a leading voice in the new urbanism movement, which promotes walkable neighborhoods and mixed-use development, something that we desperately want to see happen here in Northwest Arkansas. So, I mean, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. And it's always, it's always great to come back to Northwest Arkansas. And part of it's because I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Nebraska and in a rural context. And it actually reminds me a lot of that, just with some added growth pressures. But I think, we were talking about this before we turned on the recording here about, I think I first came probably about 8 years ago. And the first 2 times I was here, I was being brought in by developers who were looking at opportunities to develop these compact, walkable, mixed-use communities. And I've been pretty blown away. And we do work all around the country.
Sure.
Ranging from Beaufort County, South Carolina to Kauai County in Hawaii. And I've really kind of been blown away about how quickly this region is changing.
Yeah.
And even in the last 2 years, from the last time I was here, it's changed really dramatically. There's a lot of growth pressure.
Yeah, no, there absolutely is. And again, part of what we shared at this Groundworks event was this idea that we need to be the change that we so desperately seek, yes. Right? We can't look to some person somewhere else, somewhere at the federal government level, or even at the state level to come down and solve our problems. The problems have to be solved right here on the ground, which is why I think it was so important to have this Groundwork event that we had and to get everybody at the table, meaning even the listeners, those of you that are listening to this podcast, you guys have to come to the table. Everybody. It takes everyone, and people will make a difference if you give them the permission to act and to step out of their comfort zone and say, hey, I've got an idea. What about this? Because that's honestly what it takes. And it seems like you've had the opportunity to see things bloom and grow in a multitude of communities around this great country. And so I would love for you, just for this audience, let's first back up a little bit and really define what is missing middle housing. I know what it means. Some of our audience might know what it means, but I would love for you, because this is your phrase. You coined it. I said earlier, this is your trademark, missing middle housing. So how do you...
Before I jump into the definition, let me talk a little bit about the history of the idea coming to fruition. And it's in 2010, there was a Smart Growth Network had a call for papers on big ideas that planners need to know about. And, as we had been working on planning and zoning reform, form-based code projects around the country, and working with developers to try to deliver creative housing solutions, it became really clear that there was a need to frame the need for a broad range of housing choices in a way that was approachable to the general public and to city council members, all the electeds, right? Developers, architects. And so I'd actually tried a number of different names when I'm doing national presentations. And when I use the term missing middle housing, it just immediately stuck in people's head. And I'd do a presentation and people would say, what is this? Tell me more about this missing middle housing. And so in 2010, I wrote this article. And while we were writing this article, I have a really talented team of architects and planners in my office, and they worked with me to create this missing middle diagram that in a really good way seems to have permeated into almost every city's planning efforts.
Sure.
And what that is so the missing middle housing is, we define it as house scale buildings with multiple units in a walkable context. And to pull that apart a little bit, the diagram basically has single family detached houses on one end of the spectrum and the big 4, 5, 6-story apartment buildings on the other end. But the missing middle is what falls between that. It's the duplex, it's the cottage court, it's the mansion apartment. It's these range of types that exist in every neighborhood built prior to the 1940s that we stopped building. And those housing types provided attainability and the means for a family to buy a place and build some equity and move their way, build wealth, family wealth, generational wealth. And so the article in 2010 was critical to the launch. Mm-hmm. There was a ton of interest. I was doing a lot of speaking between 2010 and 2016, but in 2016, we launched missingmiddlehousing.com, where we actually just took, this is the benefit of owning your own small company. And we had a little bit of slow December, January, and we're like, we're going to do some R&D. We're going to package all of this research and documentation we've been doing related to missing middle housing, and we made it all available for free online, and hugely successful. It still generates more traffic even than our business website every month. And ultimately, I knew I needed to write a book, so I got around to finding the time to write the book, which was released in the summer of 2020, which you can imagine was not I guess it was a good time because
timing is everything. Everybody had plenty of time on their hands to sit on their back deck and read this book.
So the book's on, I think it's third printing.
Wow.
I actually just met with my publisher last week. She was in San Francisco, the rep, and said that it sold way more books than they expected. And just to plant a little seed, I'm thinking about a follow-up. So
you need to. I mean, it feels like, honestly, when I first picked it out, it was sent to me by the folks from the Northwest Arkansas Council so I could read it in advance of this. Yeah. And when I picked it up, I felt like, wow, this is like a textbook. So I'm like, in my mind, as I opened it, I was ready to learn something, right? That I needed to learn. And the stories that are in here, and even just the examples that you lay out, you make it abundantly clear what is possible. Because I think a lot of times we, in our minds, we can't, unless we physically see it and we can touch it and taste it and feel it, it's not as real to us. And I think what you've done is kind of bridge the gap, especially for, the local end user, the local developer, the local municipality, to see that, oh my gosh, what this guy has put together, this can actually happen in our community. Yeah.
And it's really interesting. When you're writing a book proposal, one of the questions is, who's your target audience?
Right.
And I had to say, well, it's probably planners and maybe some decision makers, but this is something that everybody needs to at least know a little bit about related to what's happening in their communities. And it's really turned out that way. It's, the National Association of Realtors often have us come and speak at their events. Obviously, planners. ULI has Urban Land Institute this has become part of their lexicon and what they're talking about in terms of the need for attainability and housing choice. And the biggest advocate to date right now is AARP.
Yes.
They actually they were one of the funders of the full color of the book.
Oh, okay.
And we've been working with AARP for the past 5 years now, doing education for their members, and they have 40 million members. So that's really, really can be really impactful.
Yeah. What did AARP, when they originally approached you, why did they want to be part of what you were doing here with this conversation?
Yeah. So they have a really great livable communities initiative.
Okay.
And this, obviously, their members, as we all age, we need a walkable environment where we don't have to rely on the car, right, to get places, or we don't want to be stranded in a suburban retirement home. So part of their idea was looking at existing communities and new development patterns and almost scoring it and saying here are the features that would benefit our membership as they age. And obviously housing is a key part of what makes those communities livable. And there's a specific range of housing types that, you probably won't live in a 3-story townhouse when you're, retired and into your 70s or 80s.
Right.
But so they were super interested in us plugging in to sort of talk about and educate their memberships about housing choices.
Yeah.
And why the context matters. You're not just buying a house, you're basically buying the neighborhood and the community that you're in. And that's really, for us, it's a key part of it too. It's not just housing for housing's sake. It's housing's a piece of the neighborhood.
Yeah, it is.
Recipe using Duke's.
No, it is. It is
this morning.
For sure. And I guess one of the other things as you were mentioning that, I thought about the simple fact that, and I've seen, we had somebody on, one of the authors of The Blue Zone on, talking about the importance of multi-generational housing, which is actually one of the direct correlations for why people tend to live longer in those communities, is because there's a higher incidence of multi-generational housing. But you have to have that available in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, let me give you so I've been on a bunch of different panels on multi-generational housing and how missing middle fits into that. Actually, I'm doing a ULI one. They just did a publication in a couple of months. And let's just take the classic fourplex, which is 2 units on the ground floor and 2 units above, right? With sometimes the door is shared, just stairs that take you up. So historically, right, a family might have bought the fourplex, and the core family lives in a unit. They might rent out 3 of them. Their household grows. They have a couple of kids. They expand. They combine 2 units into one.
Right. And
then they're still renting out the other 2. And then, hey, their parents age. And so their parents move into another one of the units. Right. And so there's flexibility in these missing middle types. And historically, that's the way, if you go into any city and sort of study those patterns, that's the way they worked. They were allowed, I think they were allowed to evolve in a way that current communities don't, and they can't, because they're just all one thing. And back to that same fourplex is, when I was presenting about missing middle housing in Chicago, I found a really great article that called The Missing Middle, the Working Man's Palace, right? Because there's a really rich history of immigrants moving to the U.S., just saving very thriftily, just enough to buy a 2-flat or a 3-flat. And the only way they can afford that is with the income that comes with that extra unit or 2.
Yeah.
Right. So it's they get a piece of that ownership, and then they may 10 years later have enough wealth and they decide, I want something different, or I want a different neighborhood or something. So there's the pattern of this that the missing middle types tie in directly to multi-generational living and what kind of neighborhoods would accommodate that. Yeah.
And it's funny because, as I told you earlier off before we started recording, I lived in Boston, and Boston is the home of the triple decker and the 2-family. I mean, there are multifamilies everywhere you throw a rock, you're going to hit a multifamily. And that was kind of I was familiar with row houses growing up outside of New York City, and, spending a lot of time in Harlem and other places where you have certain housing types, but to really see the proliferation of multifamily housings And also the fact that these houses, some of these are like I had a over 100-year-old two family in Dorchester, Mass. And I mean, that house was not going anywhere. And it was very unique the way it was set up with the dumbwaiter and so many just, architectural things that you just don't find in normal housing today. Yeah. But it was like somebody really thought about that and what was the best way for us to do that. And I can imagine that 2-family home that I have kind of being a home for a multi-generational family, or maybe for a brother and for 2 brothers who had 2 families that lived in the house. And so,
yeah. And that you're relating this back to a Boston makes me think about the fact that missing middle doesn't need to be one thing for every city.
Sure.
And there's a lot of, especially the further east you go, the older the cities are, the more of this they have.
Right.
Even like we did a bunch of work in Cincinnati, for example, and oh my gosh, what a rich palette of 10 different variations of just a row house,
Right.
And what I want to say is the solution, because Boston is talking about this actually. They're talking about missing middle and ADUs, and we just interviewed for a potential project. But the solution for Boston is at the upper end of a scale spectrum, and we might even call that upper missing middle.
Yeah.
And the solution for Cave Springs, Arkansas, wouldn't be that same one. It would be let's go down in scale a couple of notches to be appropriate for a smaller town that's evolving, needing to accommodate. I think that's really important to think about. There's a nuance to this that's not, the diagram simplifies it.
Yeah.
And you can say Boston's maybe at the end of that hierarchy. And if we're going to do this in Cave Springs or Beaufort County or Kauai County, it's it's now a rural crossroads that just needs to evolve with missing middle at the bottom of the spectrum. And I think it really needs to be that nuanced.
Yeah.
And thoughtful.
Well, yeah. And when I think of areas around here, it's not so much, I need to go out and get another parcel of land. It's well, you may actually already have enough land. It's just you need to have the ability and the permission to maybe add to what you already have.
Yeah.
Which I think that's kind of, to me, is the opportunity that exists, especially here in Northwest Arkansas.
Yeah. I'm staying in an Airbnb just 3 blocks north of downtown, the town square in Bentonville.
Sure.
And I walked to get a coffee this morning. I did my morning walk, and I was I've been there quite a bit, and I've walked through there. I've mountain biked through there, but I was really surprised how many vacant lots there were.
Yeah.
And how big the lots were.
Right.
And I don't know, it's just, there's opportunity starting with ADUs at the very least, put an accessory dwelling unit in the back and, anyway, so I think there's definitely opportunity. And I'm sure that's the case in most of the jurisdictions in this region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is. And it certainly is something that we are promoting. When I say we, I mean the council and groundwork. And that's the whole purpose of bringing people together to have the conversations that we're having. Because I think sometimes people think that it's a one size fits all solution, and it's really not. And I think when you look at if anybody, and we'll put all this in the show notes so that everybody that's listening to this can really get a better feel for what is the missing middle housing, but it's things that you've seen before. It's probably housing that you're familiar with, especially for those of you that are not from this part of the country. If you're from either coast, you have some familiarity with it, but you brought it home in the book in terms of what really impacted you to do this as well, in terms of relating a story about your grandmother and the great grandmother and the small space that she lived in Nebraska.
Yeah. It's, ARP, when they were interviewing me a few years ago, nobody had ever asked me this question. It's when did you start thinking about this idea of missing middle housing? And thinking back, I'm you know what? I experienced this growing up. I grew up in a town of 20,000 people, right? Not tiny, but not big. It's in a rural context, outside of a metro area. And my great-grandmother lived in a Victorian duplex. I can visualize the space. It was a tiny 1-bedroom, barely a 1-bedroom.
Yeah.
And it was everything she needed. It was within a block and a half of the main street, which had all of the services, maybe not these days. And it was also a world-class bakery, because every time I went there, it was it smelled like really amazing things. And there was something baked sitting on every possible, extra space that she had.
Right.
But that's part of it, is that's all she needed. Right. And there was no maintenance because she was renting, but it was perfect. It was perfect for her. And I think we all have these personal stories related to a missing middle housing type, right? It's like we've lived in them. Usually when people were in college is like the point at which like, oh, I used to live in a 4-plex or a 6-plex when I was in college, or right after college when I moved to Charlotte, like I lived in, a 6-plex in this great neighborhood, or my kids now live in one, or my best friend or my aunt and I think the personalization of this idea and discussion about housing choice is critical to building the support that's needed. Because one thing I emphasized in my presentation today is that we get caught up in these conversations about density. Oh, the density's too high. Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't want multifamily in my single family neighborhood.
Sure.
Oh, it's going to be too much traffic. And we sort of lose the fact that, hey, we just all need to agree that we need to provide housing choices for people that need, there's people that need missing middle from a cost of living, and there's others that want it. And we need both. And I think we just need to agree that that's our primary objective, and then get over these metrics and these concepts that like we were stuck on culturally, actually.
Yeah.
Parking.
Right.
Like, what if we could provide a 1 or 2 bedroom home or apartment to everybody that needed one if it meant they had to park on the street?
Okay.
Like, okay.
Well, yeah, and that can be heresy in some places, though, when you say that, because everybody wants their 2-car garage and all these other things that you don't necessarily need.
So let me jump back to a comment you made about the book, which I really appreciate, is it sort of demonstrates how it gets implemented.
Yeah.
And so that's why, in addition to like, there's a really broad introduction of each of the types, and we've documented them, and they can have certain metrics, right, and illustrations, but there's examples of how cities and counties have implemented zoning changes, planning changes, right, to get this enabled and built. And then there's private sector of developers. How did developers respond when cities made those changes? So there's innovations in the development community. And then it's also how the missing middle ties into the affordable housing conversation, the capital A affordable housing conversation. So, we did that on purpose. And then we also just wanted it to be super graphic and approachable, so that, like, I was on a call like 6 months ago with the state of Washington's Senate Housing Committee. They like reached out and said, we're talking about missing middle. Can you join us for a call? And I get on this call, and the chair holds up the book, right, and says, we're all reading this book. And it's like, wow, this is awesome. Like, this is really great. And so it's sort of planted the seeds in a lot of different, not just planners, right, not just developers. It's like state level politicians, economic development people. There's folks from Florida that we were just talking to that want to do a missing middle themed event. Their annual economic development conference is missing middle focus. I'm like, wow, like this is really great.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think one of the things that anybody listening to this needs to understand is that if you even remotely care about the community that you're a part of, then you're a stakeholder.
Yeah.
And everybody has a chance to get involved and lend their voice to this effort and lend their voice to the solution, as opposed to kind of sitting on the sidelines and, just complaining about one thing or the other because you don't like things a certain way. And that can be a challenge at times.
Yeah. And I think it's also, we as planners can do a better job of engaging a broader community.
Yeah.
I would say that, right, the way we did things 10 years ago isn't the way we would do it today in terms of breadth and just making sure that everybody's at the table or their voices are being heard. And we learned a lot we worked on a comprehensive plan for Memphis, Tennessee, and obviously very diverse community, a really rich Black history and population.
Sure.
And it didn't make any sense for us, white-led, California-based planning firm, to lead that. Like, it just like, we said that in our proposal. We're just like,
sure,
we'll hire us to be your strategic advisor. And the city was rebuilding their planning staff. We helped sort of create the strategy for the plan and what we needed to get out of the public process. But they partnered with like 34 existing community organizations,
sure,
right? And tapped into that wealth of information, and that they were able to extract out of that what then we needed to help inform sort of what direction we might take planning, policy, and ultimately zoning decisions. And that sort of just thoughtfulness, and it's really important, like that all the voices are heard. And in Sacramento, California, we're doing a citywide missing middle plan. And once again, like we realized we needed to tap the local network, like, and let them engage, and they have the trust, right, of the community. And the other thing, there was a component of a displacement risk assessment, because it became really clear in a place like Sacramento that's getting a lot of Bay Area spillover and costs are skyrocketing, is the first neighborhoods that are going to get impacted are the Black and brown communities that had the repressed land values.
Sure.
For, reasons we could talk hours and hours about all of our racist planning policy and federal housing policy, but
a lot to overcome, right? Of course. Yeah, so, absolutely.
But I think this should be a part of like making sure these well-intended efforts aren't displacing the people we actually are trying to provide housing for. And you need to be really thoughtful about that.
Yeah, because I've heard from so many local business owners about the challenges that they have just ensuring that their people have adequate housing that's even in proximity to where they work. Yeah. And it's such, I don't think sometimes we connect those dots, right? It's like if you go to a pizza shop and that pizza shop owner can't hire people or can't keep people staffed because none of his people can live within even 20 miles of that pizza shop, that's problematic. Yeah. And, fill in the blank, any profession, teacher, first responder, this has the benefits to any community, let alone Northwest Arkansas, to employ a lot of what we're seeing here in this book about how to think big and build small to respond to the housing crisis today can ultimately make a difference in what we're doing.
Yeah. And let me give you an example. In the neighborhood I live in, I would say about a quarter of the lots have missing middle, and the rest of them are small lot 1920s bungalows. Yeah. And what that allows is, and this is happening, it's in our neighborhood, there's a triplex. And we found out that, when my daughter was in elementary school, her first grade teacher lived in the triplex. And hey, guess what? As we talked to them a little bit more, her mother, who's also a teacher at that same school, lived in a second unit. And then 3 years later, we found out that the first grade teacher's husband, who's the PE teacher at the middle school, there's like 3 of them living in a triplex, and they wouldn't be able to afford to live in the neighborhood if it wasn't for those missing middle choices. Yeah. And like, that's just, like I said, it's so logical and it's so rational. It's like, let's just make this happen. Yeah. And so zoning, I think, is something I'd love to talk just a little bit about, because zoning was first implemented now over 100 years ago. And there's an operating system now that's still in place in most cities that's 100 years old. And so this is part of the reason that it's ineffective in delivering these housing choices, because it was never intended to do it.
Right.
So most of the good examples of this in the neighborhoods built prior to the 1940s, which is when zoning, late 20s, 30s, and 40s, before zoning was really put in place, were built before zoning was even adopted.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the work we do and have done starting 1999 was the first zoning code, form-based code we wrote with these types. It like allowed a cottage court, fourplex, and townhouses. And at the time, it was like even the planning staff in that jurisdiction were working like, what is this? But it became really apparent even then that zoning's a big problem. Like, it's a barrier, major barrier for both walkability and housing choice. And so, right, there's a ton of, Bruce in his presentation mentioned that he showed summary of a bunch of the national work that's happening, but still like a sliver of jurisdictions that have addressed zoning in an effective way.
It's hard, I think. And I think, to kind of bring it back to people that are listening to this from Northwest Arkansas, because I'm sure somebody's listening like, well, Dan, how do I combat this in my own area and deal with our zoning folks? What advice would you have, knowing what you know about Northwest Arkansas, understanding that you can't solve every problem, but just the fact that there are a lot of people out there that not just would hear this, but are actually already on the ground fighting the good fight when it comes to trying to bring some of this missing middle housing to Northwest Arkansas.
Yeah.
What would your initial advice be to them outside of getting this book and reading it and understanding it, reaching out to your team? What would you say to them to understand how to deal with this challenge?
I think my first response would be to the folks who aren't engaged yet and just encourage them to get engaged. I think don't be afraid to send an email to your city council member, to your mayor, and just say, housing choice is important to me, right? And just make sure they're hearing all the voices, and all of your electeds should hear this. And it doesn't need to necessarily be attending meetings, because I know that's really not the funnest thing to do. And
it's tough.
Takes time, and people have lives, families. But so start by writing letters to your electeds. AARP has chapters in every state and even in regions, and reach out to them and say, hey, I'd love for our local AARP chapter to host a missing middle webinar or walking tour or, something similar to just get invite your electeds in, invite the folks from your regional councils, the MPO, all to get them at the table. And I think you said this earlier, Randy, is like, it's going to take effort on everybody's part.
Right.
Not one person or one group is going to bring the solution to the table. It's going to be it's basically building the barn, right? It's the barn building of like a community effort of some realtors, some elected, some architects, some planners, some policy people. I think it's going to take a little bit of all that and each individual expertise to get to a solution, or at least a direction toward a solution.
Yeah. I always like to use the analogy when it comes to trying to solve a problem like this that just seems like unwieldy. It's like, you're trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Well, you can't do that. It's impossible to do. You need other people. If everybody comes with a teaspoon to the shoreline, you'd be surprised at what the impact that you can make. And it is sometimes, and I say that because I think for some people, it feels insurmountable. It's like, oh, none of my neighbors want that. None of my neighbors want to embrace any type of real change when it comes to housing in our community. And everything that you see is very homogenous. And I don't think I can input or impute anything that will cause people to want to change.
Yeah. Bruce said something this morning that I thought was really spot on. He was like, as a region, you need a vision.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it's probably something that really in Northwest Arkansas is, I guess in every example, it's like something that builds upon the strengths that you already have. Right? You don't want to lose what makes you unique while you're evolving and growing, but how can you grow in a way that still preserves those characteristics and aspects of your community to make sure it continues to be an attractive place to be?
Yeah. And I do want to mention that and because she actually had a chance to present during the event, but Allie Quinlan has actually given some examples to how you can introduce missing middle housing to our community right here in Northwest Arkansas. So anybody listening to this that's thinking, yeah, well, what Dan does is great and he's doing it in other communities, not here in our backyard. No, it's actually being done here. It may not be done at the pace that we would like to see it done, but you got to start somewhere. Yeah,
it's invaluable to have somebody like Ellie locally or regionally to, just really stoke the coals occasionally. Yeah, and her work's great because she's working at the development scale. She's a developer as well as somebody working on the sort of the planning and policy side of it and architecture. So it's great to have those local. And I know there's a pretty great network of urbanists here regionally.
Sure.
And that's fantastic. I think that's part of what it's going to take, but I think it's also it's going to take people outside of that, right?
Yeah. Oh no, it does.
To make it happen. But it is invaluable to have that network here already in place. And like I said, I wish the opportunities we had 7 years ago to apply missing middle had come to fruition, but for various reasons, right, they didn't, because we could have been pointing at some examples. I mean, there's examples, but even more. But it's great I have fun when I come to Northwest Arkansas, and there's just something about it that feels like it's a great place, has great people, and I like to come really hoping that I'm like planting some seeds, watering some seeds, helping cultivate some seeds.
Sure.
I don't know, because change is hard. But I do feel really strongly that it's necessary here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's necessary. And so like, I also want to be a little bit of I can be the sort of tough, the bad guy coming from outside a little bit and say like, you guys really kind of need to wake up here and do something about this, because the window won't stay open forever.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the most important point that's the biggest takeaway that I heard from what you had to say, is that I know a lot of people, you come to a place like Northwest Arkansas and you look around you and you're like, oh, there's just so much open land. There's so much this or that. And I'm like, yeah, but it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And, for proper, responsible infill development takes time and effort. It takes multiple people coming to the table and determining that, hey, this is what we need for the next 40 to 80 years. And I think I liken it to what I heard Bruce say yesterday when he was kind of talking about the time that it took Pittsburgh to kind of reorganize things in the city after the fall of the steel mills. Yeah. It was like, it was a real short 40 years. And as I was sitting in that group today with groundwork, and I'm thinking that there are several of us here that either we may not actually witness the change that we're so desperately want to see, or it will be upon the next generation to kind of carry that mantle and that baton and take it to where we want it to be, so that when people land here in 2060 or 2080, they look back and say, wow, the fathers and mothers of this community really had the foresight to plan it in a thoughtful way. Mm-hmm. And that, honestly, I think is really what we should be striving for, right? Because a lot of the things that we want to solve, we're not going to solve tomorrow. We have to play the long game.
Yeah. And I think it's important I think regions like this get caught up in thinking the solution needs to be perfect right out of the gate.
Yeah.
And every region that's done this, it's constantly evolving and changing and refining itself. Right. And so I think it's hard to get over that feeling like you need to be perfect right out of the gate.
Right.
And there's a very basic concept that I'd like to plant a seed in the conversation here regionally about growth is the highest value places, which I guess you might be able to tie to highest demand, are the existing walkable neighborhoods, right? Downtown Bentonville, from what I understand, is one of the highest, or if not the highest per square foot values. So just a very simple, basic question and conversation point is, why can't the default for new development be walkable urban?
Yeah.
Or why can't it actually be legal? Why does the default have to be auto-dependent suburban development? And because it seems really basic, is why can't we just legalize what is already so valuable so that we can build more of it? It's just basic, period. That could be the foundation of that discussion, is why can't we, or what would it take to simply legalize that pattern and replicate it around the region in the right locations?
Right.
So
from your lips to the ears of the developers and the people that do all the planning around the zoning and everything, I would hope that they would listen to that and think about what is possible.
Yeah. So. And it's like I used Beaufort County as one of the examples, and we've done this in Kauai and several other regions, but it's like target the growth and define what kind of growth you want in those target areas.
Yeah.
And it can be schematic, it can be at a vision level, but that's a pretty good initial point. And I wish it were easier, but I think it's we get caught up in what is jurisdiction A going to think versus B if we're right on the boundary of two different cities.
Yeah.
And, but it's it could really boil down to oversimplification, but why can't we legalize that walkable pattern as part of it and let it replicate? It's not the only part of a solution, once again, but the National Association of Realtors Preference Survey last year showed that over half of American households want walkable urban living.
Absolutely.
And I think something like 8% of our built environment, and maybe even less in this region, delivers that sort of walkability across the United States.
92% does not deliver that.
So that's exactly why a downtown Bentonville, there's a very basic supply and demand curve there of we need to supply more of it because the demand is really high.
So what I hear you saying is that there is a possibility.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I
wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I wasn't optimistic about being able to have an impact and work with cities and regions to sort of make these changes.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate this. And just like with Bruce, I could talk to you for hours about this because there is so much to unpack, but I'd love for you just to kind of share any final thoughts that you would have with the lens in mind that speaking to this Northwest Arkansas community as a whole. It doesn't have to be planners in Northwest Arkansas because we have some amazing planners like Allie and others. But I mean, what parting thought would you want to leave with them that might spur something?
I think in the context of missing middle housing related to a regional housing conversation, it's important for everybody to develop a shared vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen being really successful, it's talking about the building types. It's like the duplex, the fourplex, the cottage court. And so that everybody can they have a visual in their mind, or they have somebody has a collection of photographs, so that you can have a well-grounded conversation about, well, what range of these missing middle types are we going to allow and where? And I think that's a really great starting point, especially for community members who aren't architects. They're not designing these things. They're not planners who are sort of into the nuts and bolts of a zoning or policy effort. And it sounds really, really basic, but I feel like it's why a lot of our projects are super successful, because we start at that level, the level of the community members and even some of the decision makers, right? So that they can understand it and build support for it. So I think that's really important. And the missing middle housing types, two things. They are just simply one ingredient that's necessary in a walkable neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They generate, historically, if neighborhoods can generate about 20 units per acre as mixing some single family and missing middle, that's when the neighborhood main streets become viable. And that's when transit support, public transit, can become viable. So it's just it's a domino effect. Is once you start building in these patterns, it can just start to deliver a lot of what regions like this need.
Yeah.
In terms of the choices, the attainability, the walkability, the concentrated growth.
Well, I mean, you have to give the consumer what they want, right? And so if you build it like that, I mean, you can definitely address those needs.
Absolutely. And I think and build networks, right?
Yeah.
And ARP, ULI, groundwork, that's happening here. And I've seen it grown even over the last couple of years.
Right.
And so it's super exciting to see. And I know that the Northwest Arkansas Council, that I think it was Nelson that I saw speak recently on a webinar, and he was talking about a regional growth strategy. So it's all percolating, and I think it's just trying to figure out, right, who's responsible, who's doing what, how the collaboration happens. But I mean, like I said, it's just always great to be back in the region, and I wouldn't come back if I didn't feel like the missing middle housing conversation wasn't really critical to the future of this region.
Yeah.
And hoping that I'm just, as I plant the seeds and water those seeds, that it can really play a role in helping the region prosper, deliver those choices, and evolve in a way that retains this unique character that it has.
Yeah. Well, I certainly thank you for coming here and taking time to speak to us and encourage us to continue to fight this good fight of better housing.
Yeah.
In a region where we're growing so fast, we don't really have a choice. We have to embrace this or figure out a way to do it. And that's essentially what we're all doing right now. And that's why we had you on the podcast. So thank you so much, Daniel Parolek, for coming on the podcast, sharing it. The book is Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis. I really want to encourage you, if you're watching the video, get this book. We will put a link to it on Amazon. I don't get anything for that, but we really want to support the work and effort that Daniel and his team are doing, because they're helping other communities like ours here in Northwest Arkansas. And so I really want to encourage you. And finally, I've said it several times, all of our listeners, please share this podcast episode, share the episode that we did with Bruce Katz, all of these groundwork. And we're going to have a few more groundwork sponsored podcast episodes that we really want you to share, because again, you have to be a part of the change that you seek. I'm seeking change here in Northwest Arkansas. I'd like you to join me and do that as well. And so, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it, folks. Another episode of the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast. To learn more about us, please follow us at iamnorthwestarkansas.com. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can write a review. You can check out the podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast on every major podcasting platform. And don't forget, our podcast comes out every Monday, rain or shine. I'm your host, Randy Wilburn, and we'll see you back here next week for another new episode of the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast. Peace.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of I Am Northwest Arkansas. Check us out each and every week, available anywhere that great podcasts can be found. For show notes or more information on becoming a guest, visit iamnorthwestarkansas.com. We'll see you next week on I Am Northwest Arkansas.